Great. Okay, Tim, now you look much better with the background. Okay, it's about time. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to this session 4 of the Research Methods Division CARMA Consortium. So I know you have been learning a lot from the previous sessions. So we will have this session about overcoming the hurdles for methodology regarding publications and research, get your high quality research done. So before we start, I want to talk about the agenda for today. First, I'm the moderator. My name is Zhen Zhang. I work at the Southern Methodist University, and I will be collecting questions today and asking the panelists to answer those questions. So the agenda items today, first we'll have Larry Williams to introduce CARMA and encourage you to join CARMA and Research Methods Division, of course, a little bit. He will use a few minutes. Then we will start with Chris Byron. Chris is a senior associate editor at Journal of Management. And after that, we'll have Insoo Oh, who is an associate editor at the Journal of Applied Psychology. Then our third panelist is Tim Quigley. He is a associate editor at the Strategic Management Journal. And during the thought sharing process of the three panelists, feel free to ask questions in the chat function. And I will be monitoring the chat window and collect all the questions you may have so that we can put them into themes. Then I will be asking questions based on the theme, and I will make sure we cover everyone's questions. If you guys do not have that many questions, I will add mine to the list so that we make sure the panelists will be busy and working hard to answer those questions. So that is the agenda. So without further ado, let's hand over to Larry for his welcome and introduction.
Yeah, greetings, everybody. As Zen said, I'm Larry Williams, the director of CARMA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 4th session of the RMD CARMA Consortium, which we have been very happy and thankful to collaborate with the Methods Division over the past several years. As a member of the division, I'd like to pass on my congrats to the exec committee for their work in organizing this and for contributing, and for all the panelists that have also contributed to it as well. I won't take much time talking about CARMA. You have information on our website about what we do. Our institutional membership program is open for registration. We've got a great lineup of webcast lectures, as well as other exciting new types of events planned for the next year. We're also finalizing an aggressive live online short course program. So with that, I'll turn it back to you guys. Have a great time. You should know that the recordings from this session and all the other sessions will be posted on the CARMA YouTube channel, and we will make sure that all those links are available and distributed to Research Methods Division members. So thanks, Zen, and good luck and have fun.
Thank you, Larry, for the introduction and also making the videos available for viewing later. So now let's start with our first panelist, Chris. Chris, you should have the capacity to share slides if you are ready. Let me see. Okay. Hi, Chris.
Hi, I'm sorry, we lost power for a second.
Oh, sorry to hear that. I had the same thing, 2 weeks ago, just 1 second, but the computer was down.
And then I think the internet had to reset, so
okay,
it just took a second. Hopefully.
So Chris, if you have your slides, feel free to start sharing your screen.
I do. Now I have to reopen them since my computer shut down, so it might take a second. Okay, so everyone can see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. All right, great. So I'll get started. I'm Chris Byron. I'm the senior editor for methods at Journal of Management. Prior to this, I was an associate editor at Academy of Management Review. And I'm a professor at Georgia State University. So that's my background. I approach this perhaps differently than my colleagues, I'm not sure. But I thought about this really broadly in terms of clearing methodological hurdles. So not quite so specifically to Journal of Management, but really about kind of what reviewers and associate editors look at when they're approaching your paper. I think that when reviewers get your paper, they ask themselves, can I trust these authors and the study's methods and results? So they're really looking for clues about the extent to which they can trust what you've written down, because obviously they have very incomplete information. They don't get to see everything that you've done. I mean, certainly with some of the new requirements that journals have, there's, some more information that they can have, but there's still, what's pretty obviously a lot of ability, and I'm not in any way advocating for this, a lot of ability for fraud. And so they really are trying to figure out, can they trust you? So I think one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to figure out trust. And so if we think about what the basis is for trust, the relevant factors here are really your ability and your integrity. So they're thinking about, all right, is this person competent? And do I think that this author or author group, do I think that they acted in an honest and ethical way? But the issue is that they don't know who you are. So perhaps you have a stellar reputation. And your stellar reputation could be that you're this very honest person, that you are, a person that's, very upstanding, of the highest ethical standards, and you have amazing method skills. I mean, you are a methodologist, But the fact is that they don't know who you are because of the blind review process. So again, they've got to look for clues about your ability and your integrity. So I think that as an author, it's really your job to signal your ability and integrity. Of course, now, I mean, obviously my suggestion through and through is that you behave with ability and integrity, but you also need to signal this ability and integrity. So how can you do that? One of the first things that you can do is follow the journal's submission requirements. And this is really, I think this was one of the most surprising things to me, both when I started off in my academic career, but also when I became an associate editor. I was surprised at how much people really are sticklers for authors following submission requirements. I remember as a wee little doctoral student, I submitted my first paper to a journal as a sole author, and I had submitted it with an earlier version, using an earlier version of the APA manual. And all three of my reviewers were like, why didn't you use the correct manual? And I remember thinking, what? Like, what's wrong with these people? In retrospect, now I understand it. They're looking at me, and they were looking at this paper and thinking, how come I didn't know any better? So this was a crucial piece of information for them, that I wasn't following these norms for the journal. So every journal has submission requirements, and it's really important to follow them. So for example, Journal of Management has quantitative submission reporting requirements. It's really important to follow those very closely. Every journal has some reporting requirements or some formatting requirements, and you really do need to follow them to a T. I think a lot of times people think, oh, that's okay, I don't need to follow them. And if the paper gets accepted, then I'll format it correctly. And that is a huge mistake. And I'll explain a little bit more why later. But the fact is that reviewers and associate editors get really mad oftentimes when you don't follow these requirements. And it's just a missed opportunity. It's kind of an easy thing for you to do. So why not do it? The other thing that you need to do is really detail your methods. I think a crucial piece of information to remember here is that you're a technical writer. And so really approach this craft as in that way, that you are writing in a way that your goal is so that someone could theoretically come behind you and be able to replicate what you've done and get the exact same results. And so what that means is being very exacting in terms of describing what exactly you've done. So I personally do a lot of meta-analyses, and I have to say that it drives me crazy how little or how often I will say authors will really detail their methods. And by detail their methods, I mean that you describe your sample in detail. Who, if these are people, who are these people? Where did they come from? And how many were in your final sample? And, what's their ages? And, give us information about them. Or if they're firms, tell us, where are they? What was your sampling criteria? Tell us how each variable was measured. I mean, that's so important. What was the range? Give us information about this. And what analyses did you conduct? And again, tell us them in detail. Were there any assumptions that you used? Were there any, just tell us exactly what you did. Again, with the idea that someone could come behind you and do exactly what you did and get the exact same results. People do not do that enough, and it is a personal pet peeve of mine. And so it's really important to provide that detail. Another thing that you need to do to signal your ability and your integrity is to accurately report your results. And by this, what I mean is you do not overstate your findings. Trust me, we are looking for the moment you start overselling what you found, that is a total red flag. So just be honest about what you found. You don't have to support for everything that you hypothesized, so you just didn't. So that's fine. And so just not overstating your findings is really important. Another really important thing is to use citations correctly. So as someone who trains a lot of doctoral students, I will say, this is also a pet peeve of mine. Do not rely on how others have cited a work. So let's say that you're reading, Zhang and Dawson 2012. Well, sorry, I won't use their names because they would cite things correctly. So we'll say Williams 2012. Just joking, Larry. So no, but so no, so let's say someone cited something, and let's say they cited, I'll just say, Byron 2008. And they said, oh, Byron 2008 found blah, 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 blah. And you go, oh, okay, well, that must be what Byron 2008 found. So I'm going to just go on their word and I'm going to use the citation in the exact same way. Well, that's not always the case. And what I've seen oftentimes is that one author will cite something incorrectly, and then it's like a snowball. Other people cited incorrectly from there. Go back and retrieve Byron 2008. I mean, I was at a loss for thinking of other names, but so it's just really important to get things right. Because what if someone knows that they're not going to know my work, but like, let's say hypothetically someone knew my work, then they would go, wait a second, they cited this work incorrectly. I mean, again, all of a sudden now trust has been broken. So just make sure that you retrieve citations yourself and that you use them correctly. And then another important thing, another last way that you can signal your ability and integrity to reviewers is to acknowledge shortcomings. You know, every single study has shortcomings, and you need to talk about how your study has some shortcomings, and you can discuss how you address them if you were able to address them, or that you acknowledge them and that these are opportunities for future research. But the fact is that, you know, if you just act like there are no shortcomings, and then they're just these kind of red flag shortcomings, reviewers are going to pounce on that, and they're going to doubt your ability and integrity because you did not acknowledge them yourself. Once you lose your reviewers' trust, it's so difficult to win them back. Again, they don't know you, so there's no basis for trust. They just don't have a reputation, you know, to go on. So once you've lost it, you just can't get it back. What I mean by this is that, let's say that you're sloppy in one place in your submission, they are going to infer that you've been sloppy in other places, and they can infer that you're sloppy in other places that they perhaps can't even detect, meaning that they're going to be asking questions like, well, okay, I can see that they were sloppy in their citations, so maybe they were also, probably they were sloppy in the way that they conducted their analyses, and I can't really look at their analyses. I mean, I can't, actually, look to verify whether or not they were. I can verify the citations, but I can't verify their analyses. And so now you've put all these questions in their minds. And so, and again, they don't have anything else to rely on, like your reputation. So you've just lost their trust. When you don't follow the rules and the guidelines of the journal, it means that they're going to infer that you can't be trusted to follow other norms in the field or guidance on how to use a method. So you haven't, for example, followed the guidelines about how to format the manuscript. And so they may think, okay, well, you can't be trusted to do that. How do we know that you could be trusted to follow guidance about how to use this specific statistical technique? And because you're a person, we think at this point, who's not able to follow guidelines. If you play loose and fast in your interpretation, it means that they may infer that you're not a capable and competent methodologist. So if they think, okay, you've just been way too, you've overstated your findings, they're going to think, oh, okay, we just can't trust you to really accurately convey what your findings are. And then lastly, when you confuse your readers, for example, you call a variable by different names. So in one place you call it R&D intensity, at another place you call it innovation. You call things all different names, or you use acronyms a lot. So you're causing your reader to constantly have to think of, what does CWB stand for? So their brains are kind of working overtime while they're reading, trying to figure out what's the author's meaning here. They may infer that you're just not a trustworthy narrator. So they're working so hard at trying to figure out what exactly you've done here that they're just going to think you just can't be trustworthy as a person who's conveying your results. So more generally, reviewers and associate editors are looking at your paper and trying to figure out if they have confidence about your ability to fix issues. So this is a crucial point here, is that when they're looking at your paper and trying to figure out, do we reject or do we give this paper a chance to revise? They're thinking about, do we think these folks could turn it around? Like if we give them a shot, do we trust that they have the confidence to fix these issues? So you've got to make sure that you know any relevant existing literature, that you point out why literature that you haven't mentioned isn't relevant. So if your friendly reviewers are saying, what about this? Or how about this? They're mentioning literatures that you haven't incorporated. You might add a sentence or two that say, at first glance, it might seem that this is relevant, but here's why it isn't. So it's really important to address those concerns that friendly reviewers have pointed out. Again, correctly citing literature is so important. So when to cite something and when not to cite something, that you've carefully proofread your paper for spelling and grammar issues. Again, you're trying to build confidence. And if your paper is sloppy, you're just not building confidence in the reviewers and the associate editor. And then again, I just can't emphasize this enough, observing journal norms and doing your homework. So looking at recently published journal and trying to figure out how long are they normally, what's the order in which they discuss things? What do they look like? What's the tone? So making sure that you've written your paper for that specific journal. That's it. And so I missed the introduction before, but I'm assuming we're waiting for questions to the end. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I will be saving the audience questions through the chat box and put the questions into themes, then asking you guys the questions later once all the panelists finish. Thank you, Chris. Those are very helpful suggestions and recommendations for authors. Those will be
recommendation for all of us.
Those will be very useful for everyone to prepare your high quality submissions. So our next panelist is Insoo Oh from Journal of Applied Psychology. Insoo, when you are ready, please feel free to start.
So I unmute this. So I'm going to start. Hello, everyone. I'm Insoo. I'm an associate editor at the Journal of Applied Psychology. But today, actually, even though I'm representing Journal of Applied Psychology, what I'm going to share is based upon my experience as an AE at 2 journals, including JAP, as well as Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology. And editorial board member for multiple journals and as an author. So what I'm going to share is pretty much what I have learned over the years about how to publish in top tier journals, but focusing on methodological issues. And then also when I'm talking about these issues, I'm going to also use the language reviewers and action editors open use. So you're going to have some real sense about what are the issues and how we can address those issues. So my next slide is that actually I'm going to talk about several broad methodological issues first. So, and then I'm going to talk about some specific methodological issues and how we can avoid them or how we can address them proactively. So first issue I'm going to talk about is actually oftentimes the review team going to see a kind of disconnect between conceptualization and operationalization. Even though there are some other types of mismatch or disconnects, I want to talk about several things that are kind of very common across many journal submissions. So for example, in many papers that I have reviewed or decisioned, I found that I think oftentimes authors are talking about A, such as broad OCB, but in their measurement or in their actual test, they are using a very specific dimension of OCB, such as personal helping. Then the review team going to say this is a huge disconnect or mismatch between what you theorize, because your theorization is based upon broad OCB, but what you actually measured is personal helping. So I think before I think you're submitting your paper to any journal, it's better to have some friendly review, but not so friendly review, so that they can see this kind of problems and you can correct these problems before submission. And also there are other types of disconnects, such as in the introduction section, you are talking about mixed findings in the literature. Actually, that's usually a setup for moderation, but in the paper, in the middle of the paper, you are talking about mediation, and you are suggesting some mediator as a important mechanism between your focal variables. Then it's also another disconnect. So I think overall, I think you got to minimize this kind of disconnect. And also another type of disconnect is like that. So when you're talking about the relationship between two variables, such as x and y, you often heavily rely upon some specific theoretical mechanisms. But reviewers cannot see the corresponding processes or mediating variables. So then also it's sort of disconnect you want to minimize. And I think how we can detect that. Usually, I think it's better to have a friendly review, but as I said, a not so friendly review. And another thing I think, based upon my own experience, when I'm reviewing or working on a meta-analysis, and nowadays actually, we don't see a mere summary of the literature in the form of meta-analysis. So if you are working on a meta-analysis, then I think you need to understand meta-analysis as a kind of another research method, such as HLM or regression or SEM or any other method. So what does that mean? You can use meta-analysis to answer any research question you have. Even though there are some limitations in meta-analysis, but meta-analysis should be regarded as a research process and research method, not just a tool for a review or summary. So I think an excellent meta-analysis should go beyond a mere summary of the relevant literature by providing original insight, unique insights into the topic in question. For example, by identifying some crucial underlying tension across existing studies in certain literature, or reconciling mixed findings and testing important moderators not examined or rarely examined in any input studies, and or testing a theory-driven model. So I think that way I think you can overcome initial a methodological hurdle for meta-analysis. And I have a few more this is something quite common. I think in some papers I see that their model is too simple. They are just focusing on the relationship between two variables without examining the mediating or moderating mechanisms. So then reviewers going to easily say, your study provides us with very limited understanding about the association between X and Y. So I think, in this case, the problem is being too simple. Or sometimes your problem might be, it's not always a problem, by the way, but your problem is that I think you are focusing on a very narrow concept, or a very narrow research context, such as your sample is entirely nurses or doctors. It's not a problem, but I think, reviewers may, I think that your study has not that generalizable, right? In terms of generalizability, that can be an issue. So to compensate for that, you need to provide very in-depth knowledge about the concept or context. So that means you need to actually make an extremely strong, narrow contribution if your topic is very narrow or if your context is very narrow. This is something I want to convey. And then also in terms of model testing, or even in terms of the number of hypotheses, more is not always better. I think I've seen many papers that are overly complex. They have 12, 15 hypotheses, and their model includes 20, 30 variables. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think then I think a reviewer is going to say you are actually throwing the theoretical kitchen sink. And also, it's indirectly means that you are relying on too many tangentially relevant theoretical perspectives. So the better strategy is actually choose one or two theoretical perspectives and then go deeper. And also, if you are using multiple theoretical perspectives, then it's integrate them. Otherwise, I think people are going to see, I think many problems in your a theorization. And I'm going to talk about some, specific methodological issues, and several issues relate to lack of methodological rigor. So one is, I think, which is obvious, I think, when you are considering publishing in a top-tier journal, try to avoid using single source cross-sectional data. I'm not saying this kind of data is always bad, but I think in the eye of reviewers and action editor, this is kind of unusual, and also this is not uncommon. If you look at any top-tier journal articles, many articles are based upon multiple samples and multi-wave and multi-source, even multi-level data. So I think even if your question can be addressed by single source cross-sectional data, I think my recommendation is actually just don't rely upon one single source cross-sectional data. It's better to have like another data, maybe that's based upon experiment or or archival data. That way, I think you can increase the credibility of your findings, and also you can make your paper more rigorous, and then also rule out some important alternative explanations. So how you can do it, I think you need to use proper controls. Don't over control, but don't under control. And also test alternative models. If there are some competing hypotheses or theoretical perspectives, then test those alternative models, and then compare the model fit, right? And then also, if it's possible, since we are talking about publishing in top-tier journals, it's better to triangulate your findings with mixed methods. So, for example, if your research questions is about mediation, right? Then I think you can use survey data, right? Preferably longitudinal or cross-select data. But at the same time, you can use experiment. And if the findings converge, then I think it's going to increase the credibility of your findings, and you're going to have a much better chance to publish in that top-tier journal. And also, it's better to be overall conservative than liberal. So don't use marginal significance. You can use definitely one-tailed test or 90% confidence interval when you have a directional hypothesis. And if that's your rationale, then clarify it in your paper. Some people just use the term like a marginal significant or p smaller than 0.1 without any rationale, without any compelling rationale. Then that's a problem. I think it's gonna decrease your credibility as an author, Chris mentioned. And also use statistical methods that are most rigorous. So for example, even if your ICC1 value is small, I prefer to report results based upon HLM rather than OLS. Or if you report results based upon OLS because you want to show R or R square or their change, then I think you got to clearly mention that HLM results are available from the corresponding author, so that they know that you considered both options. And also, if there's any methodological issues in your paper, if you know that, if you're aware of that, don't try to bury or obscure them, because reviewers are not dumb. And also, I like this kind of a quote from a very old editorial by Phil Bapko, who is also my co-author. He said, I think listing limitations do not make them go away. So if you think there are major limitations in your study, especially in terms of methodology, then you got to proactively address them before submitting your paper to a journal. Because as I mentioned, reviewers are not dumb, and also action editors are not dumb. So I think you got to remember that. And also, this is kind of pretty much my last slides, and this is something Chris already mentioned, so I'm not going to talk about too much of that, but I think try to conform to journal reporting guidelines. Do your homework. If you are submitting your paper to JAP, then you got to conform to APA's publication guidelines. And if you are submitting to AMJ, then you got to actually conform to AMJ's reporting guidelines, right? And also another interesting thing is that I think when I see even regression tables or hierarchical linear modeling result tables, I don't see consistency across many different articles. But what I see as a problem is that when you underreport, for example, you are reporting OLS regression result without reporting R or R square. That's a huge problem, I think. So, and then also when you are reporting unstandardized beta weights without reporting an intercept, that's also something quite funny. So I think don't make that kind of a mistake, even though I know those authors know those things, but sometimes they forget. So I think try to be very careful, carefully checking your a paper before submission. And also in terms of design and data analysis, nowadays many journals, especially JAP, require transparency and openness. So if you use some R script, then I think provide that R script in a supplementary material or in other ways. And also or journals have their own methodological checklist. For example, a JAP has one. So I'm going to show that in the next slides. So I think try to check that before submitting your paper to a journal. And JAP also going to soon implement TOP, transparency and openness promotion guidelines. And you got to follow that beginning this November. So I think also, try to be update about this kind of change in the journal you are trying to target. And also, I think this is kind of based upon my experiences over the years. Many papers, they always report descriptive statistics in table 1, such as means and standard deviations and intercorrelations among their study and control variables. But often they just ignore them. So they don't mention anything about their table 1. Other than that, I think we report these descriptive statistics in table 1. I think that's a huge problem. And recently, Kevin Murphy, a former editor of JAP, kind of mentioned that as a problem. I think we got to actually also use descriptive statistics in addition to inferential statistics, as we do in meta-analysis. So I think that's because descriptive statistics can tell you a lot about your even a model testing result, whether those results are plausible or not. And then, as I mentioned, soon beginning November 1st, JAP will implement this TOP guidelines. So you got to provide more transparent information about citation and data and your syntax and other supplementary materials and other things. So what I want to emphasize that before maybe most journals do not require this, and more journals gonna require this kind of TOP guidelines. So when you are doing research and also when you are analyzing, you got to save your materials, and also you got to organize them, because later you need to actually provide them to the readers who are interested in seeing that. And finally, I just mentioned JAP has this methodological checklist. So I'm going to share my slide, my screen. Okay. Yeah, my screen. See that? If I click that in, this is available on the JAP website. This is methodological checklist. So you got to actually check so many things in terms of method, your sample, your scale, and also analysis and result. And also we have specific a section for meta-analysis, how you report your result, and then also qualitative and mixed methods as well. So I think you got to make yourself familiarized with this kind of checklist before submitting your paper to JAP and other top-tier journals. Okay, that's actually pretty much everything. And thank you all for attending this meeting. I know some of you guys are joining us from Europe and Asia, so it's gonna be late, I think. But anyhow, I'm really glad that I had this chance to share all these lessons with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Insoo, for the very concrete suggestions, especially the JAP's list for making sure that we report sufficient and accurate information. That list will be helpful not only for JAP, but for all the other journals, because those are necessary to build up the confidence from the editor and the reviewers, as Chris has mentioned. So I would like to encourage you again in the audience to please put your questions in the chat box so that I can collect all the questions together so that we can ask the three panelists after Tim quickly finishes. So our third panelist is Tim Quickly, representing Strategic Management Journal. And let's welcome Tim for his thoughts.
There we go. Sorry, I'm out of practice of doing Zoom. It's been a few weeks. I had to turn the mic back on there. So welcome everybody, and thanks for having me. I want to start and give you a quick overview of kind of what I want to do. I want to talk about this idea of building a body of evidence to support your work, and I'll share with you what my thoughts are about what that means. In doing so, it's interesting as I listen to Chris and Insoo talk about their perspectives on this, and Chris talking about trust and the challenge of this information asymmetry that exists between an author and reviewers and the editorial team that's making decisions on your paper. And so I think some of the ideas I'll talk about will mesh with that. And Insoo talked about worrying about not getting overly complex, and starting with the basics of interpreting your findings and your descriptive statistics, and just looking at basic correlations and sort of bringing people along to sort of see, hey, listen, there's some foundational relationships in my data that we'd expect, and how that builds trust and starts to get the reviewers up to speed on what it is you're doing. All of these things go a long way to kind of building this body of evidence that I'll talk about. In order to do that, I'm going to actually step back and talk a little bit about the basics and stats. And maybe everybody here is up to speed and is going to get an ace on this. I'm going to actually put a little quiz up here shortly. I'm going to talk a little bit about p-values and hopefully get at a little bit about why S&J dropped stars from their tables. So we'll talk through that a little bit of what it means and how understanding that can help you down the road of building this body of evidence to support your work. And then I want to kind of finish up. That's kind of the first half, and then I'll finish up. I've got a few comments kind of echoing, I think, what Insoo talked about in terms of this movement in the field, not just management, but social sciences and all of science, really, about transparency, data sharing, code sharing, all these kinds of things. And then I've got a few tips about the review process, and maybe also thinking about what it means when you're the reviewer, and I'll share some thoughts on that. So just kind of to start us off, I've actually got a slide I often share with my PhD students early in a methods class I teach, where I talk about what is econometrics. Now, this is focused on macro scholars generally, but I think the concepts here, even though they come from an econometrics text, I think they apply to our OB colleagues, our micro colleagues as well. It's funny, if you dig into these books, right, there's no agreed upon definition of what econometrics is, but if we start describing it, or what distinguishes it, Kennedy talks about it's what distinguishes an econometrician from a statistician is the things that it's the former, the econometrician, the applied scientists that we all are. It's our preoccupation with problems caused by violations of the statisticians' standard assumptions about the models that we're using. Right? We use these models, and the statisticians tell us, hey, your data has to be normal, and the error terms have to be randomly distributed, and there's this and there's that. Of course, we ignore all that. We say, yeah, but it's close enough. And so all of the tricks and tools and hoops we have to jump through really are a function of recognizing that our models violate the assumptions. And of course, even when we go to these new models, there are often new assumptions and often new violations of assumptions. Kennedy talks about the need for econometricians and social scientists, I think this applies in general, to studying awkward, dirty data, right? That things are not normally distributed. Things are not, sort of the standard package that statisticians who designed these tools assume when they built their model. So because of all of this, there's no such thing as a perfect study. There's no such thing as a model that you can run that says, I've got a p-value of this. That means we've proven something, right? Because no, we can't prove anything. These are all statistical inferences. There are no perfect models. We are always violating assumptions, and we have to just embrace that and live with it. And so what do we do about that? So we have to build a body of evidence. Okay? I'm going to keep using this term. We have to build a body of evidence in support of our results. And so let me start this by saying, a p-value, right? It used to be, you go back, and especially in the strategy literature, you go back to the early 80s and you read an SMJ or an AMJ paper, and somebody runs a model and they report, we got a p-value of 0.042, it supports our model, and that's it. They don't go any further, right? They don't interpret their effect sizes, they don't run any alternative models, no supplemental analyses, nothing. And so, we can't do that anymore, right? We have to go much further beyond that. Well, why is that? So let's ask this very basic question. What is a p-value, okay? And so before I do that, I'm going to ask you a question. Here's the quiz for today. So apologize up front if you weren't expecting a quiz. We're going to do this very easy one here. But I want you to imagine that I go into Stata or whatever software package you have, and I create a data set of 1,000 rows of data. And of that 1,000 rows of data, I create a random y variable and 100 random x variables. And I just realized my slide is backwards. I have a random x and 100 random y's. It should be the other way. A random y variable and 100 random x variables, okay? So, and then I imagine I run 100 regressions where I predict that y variable with each of the x variables in separate models. So it's x1 predicting y. That's one model. x2 predicting y, x3, x4, x5. I run 100 models. How many times am I going to get a p less than 0.05? So I just pasted a form, a Google Sheet form, and a little survey form into the chat. I want you to click on that link, and I want you to go to that form, and I want you to give us your answer. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to do that. How many times do you think we're going to get a p less than 0.05 when I predict 100 models of a randomly generated x variable predicting a randomly generated y variable? So we're up to about, looks like 21 of you guys have responded so far. I'm going to try and keep it open here another 15, 20 seconds here. Up to 25. Come on, everybody go ahead and click on that link and stick your neck out. We're not collecting names, so there's no fear here. We're not going to shame anybody. And I can tell you that when I run this with my doctoral students, maybe a third get it right. And even the ones that get it right, when I start talking about it, kind of look at me, with their head a little twisted. So we're up to 28. Come on now, there's 70 people on this call. Let's see if we can get to 40 real quick here. 20 more seconds, 15 seconds. 10. Come on, a few more. We're at 31. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're up to 33. All right, that's good enough. We're good enough here. So let's take a look at the results here quick. So here's the results. We even got a few more coming in here. Feel free to keep clicking the link if you're still debating your answer. Actually, I should shut it off now that you can see what the answer is here. So 58% of you got it right. The answer is 5. We would expect, we have randomly generated data, randomly generated x variables, randomly generated y variables, and we run 100 models. We would expect to get p less than 0.05 exactly 5 times. Okay, and I'm not going to get into what people, we can see here, 10, 15, 20, 25, more than 25, 7 people said that, 1 person said 3, so around the board here. So, I mean, honestly, if you look at this, right, half the people said 5, roughly half the people said, or maybe 60-40 here, something other than 5, right? And the answer is we would expect exactly, we would expect 5. Now, are we going to get 5 every time? No. And I just want to demonstrate this, okay? So I'm gonna pull up Stata really quick here, right? So here's Stata, right? And I'm gonna show you my do file here, I'm setting a seed here just so it starts from the same spot. I'm creating 1,000 observations. I'm generating a Y variable that's randomly, but normally distributed, but random. We're going to see a histogram of that. And then down here, where are my X variables? Oh, I generate my X variable inside this loop that I run 100 times. So each of my regressions is run in this loop. I run a regression, and then I report out the betas and save them into the data set so I can see them here. So I'm going to run this, okay? So here it is, okay? And all I did was, actually here, let me run this again. Move this over, right? Here's our distribution of our that was our distribution of our X variable. Here's our distribution of our betas that we get from the 100 models, okay? And it turns out, if we look at this, if I count here, how many p-values less than 0.05? In this particular run, there were 7. If I go to 0.1, there's 14. And let me run this again, just to, and this time I'm going to get rid of this seed so it actually generates a new set of random variables this time. We're going to get a different answer this time. Okay, there's the X variable or the Y variable. Here's the distribution of our betas. Okay, and this time we got 6. And if I do this again, this time we got 4. And if I do it again, we'll get something different each time, right? But the expectation is, with completely random data, if I run 100 models with completely random data, predicting completely random data, the definition of a p-value is I'm going to get a p less than 0.05 around 5 times. That's the expectation, okay? So what do we do with that, okay? What do we do with that? So what is a p-value, right? So recall that when we have a p-value, what are we trying to do? We're trying to make inferences about a population. And if we could, right, we'd go to the entire population and ask everybody or test everybody based on the study we're trying to accomplish. But we can't do that, right? So we go into the population with a big scoop and we grab a bunch of data, hopefully a random sample. That's a big assumption too, right? And we run statistical tests on that sample, and hopefully we can draw inferences about the population based on that sample, okay? And so the p-value is simply the probability of getting a result that we found in a sample when it doesn't really exist, right? So p equals 0.05. It's saying there's a 5% chance that this relationship that we're seeing here is spurious. It doesn't really exist, right? For whatever reason, and you can read the history of this, there's a long history about this. We decided long ago as scientists that p less than 0.05 is the cutoff, right? Or maybe less than 0.10, right? There's a 10% chance of us being wrong, right? And so think about it, right? What does this really mean? Imagine everybody on this call today. There's 71 people on this call. We all go off this afternoon, we start a study, we gather a bunch of data, we run our model, right? At the end of the day, how many of us have publishable findings, right? 5% of us, right? 3.5, something like that, are going to find something. Let's say it a different way. Imagine one of you gets a p-value of 0.051 and somebody else gets a p-value of 0.049. One person's going out for drinks, one person's banging their head against the wall, and trying to figure out what to do with their model, right? But does it really matter? Is there, right? We have statistical tests, and I guarantee you in your data, unless you've got millions of rows of data, if you test the difference between the beta that generated the 0.049 p-value and the beta that generated the 0.051, there's no meaningful difference there. And what SMJ has said is that we should stop pretending like there is, right? That's the point of this, right? And we're going to give authors permission to sort of say, you know what, if you get a p-value of 0.062, that's fine. Interpret it. Tell us what the effect size is. Run some other models to kind of demonstrate that those results are robust to alternative treatments, alternative measures, alternative model specifications, alternative estimations. And if we do that, maybe we can actually trust the 0.062, and you don't have to go through a process of p-hacking, adding controls, removing controls, trying to add more data just to get that p equals 0.049, which is something we know happens, okay? P-values are what they are. We have to understand what they are. We can't, we can't go beyond what they are and pretend that there's something that they're not, okay? So Reviewers, right? So what does this mean from the review process, right? Reviewers, editors, we start from the perspective that you ran 100 different models and you're presenting the 5 that worked. And it was nothing more than random chance. Okay, that's this trust issue. You know, Chris started talking about this idea of trust, right? Convince me as a reviewer that you didn't run 100 models and you didn't just present the 5 that worked, right? And how do we do that, right? Well, that gets into this idea of building a body of evidence, right? Our data can be awful. Our methods are compromises. There's nothing perfect. P-values are what they are, right? They're just a probability that our findings are actually nothing but random noise. And a 5% chance that our findings are random noise is not trivial. And so we have to think of our results section as a chance to present a body of evidence that our results are really what they are, okay? And so what do I mean by this, right? Oops, I went backwards here. What is a body of evidence? We want to, in our methods section, we want to present multiple tests, multiple approaches that link together to support the core of your findings, okay? We want to not just present a main model with a p less than 0.05 with a star next to it and say, look, my hypothesis is true, right? No, we want to, in the method section we wrote up, we measured the x variables this way, and we measured the y variable that way, and you made 100 decisions in the research design process, right? Well, what if you had made a different decision? Do the results hold? If so, tell us, right? Use alternative measures, use alternative methods. Maybe there's 2 different statistical estimators you could use. Neither one of them is perfect. Maybe one is more traditional in the literature, but there's an emerging way to do it that you can borrow from some other literature. Show both, right? Come up with alternative approaches, okay? Interpret your results. So SMJ requires this. We now require at SMJ, you report the p-values, you report effect sizes, you report confidence intervals, right? Tell us that even if you have a p equals 0.10, if the effect size is so large that a 1 standard deviation in your x variable leads to a $50 billion change in the profitability of a company, well, you're going to get my attention, right? Interpret your effect sizes. What does it mean to have movement along the x variable of interest to the outcome? Okay, and share that. And it doesn't matter whether you're an OB strategy, it doesn't matter. Like, help us understand what that means and do it within a reasonable range of the actual data. Okay, you know, I'm a real stickler for this. I don't want to see that just at the extremes there's some meaningful difference. Show me that across the range of data, across some reasonable range of data, the upper and lower thirds, there are reasonable differences that this effect, this relationship is meaningful out in the real world. And also consider sharing some real cases from your data. Dig into your data and show me that there's an entity out there, a person, a company, whatever it is you're studying, that actually experienced the kind of variance in the relationship that you're showing, right? Give us some anecdotal information. I think it adds some realism to your data. Now, the last thing on this is be your own toughest critic. Ask the sure but question, okay? And what I mean by that, your reviewer is reading your paper and they're going through the methods and they're saying, you did this and you did that. And they're looking here, well, sure, but did you think of? Sure, but did you consider the possibility that? Sure, but, right? Ask those questions of yourself. Send your paper to a friendly reviewer and ask them to generate those questions for you, and then incorporate that feedback into your paper, right? And so what does that look like, right? So think about this from the process of a reviewer and their psychology, okay? So think about this. You're reading a paper and you as a reviewer say, sure, but what if you measure the variable this different way, like Smith and Jones did in 2015, or, oh, sure, I follow what it is you're doing here, but what if, you know, maybe the world's aligned a certain way, and if you run this alternative test, that's going to maybe disprove what it is you think you're showing here. Why don't you run that test, right? Well, imagine you do that. Imagine a few pages later, you as an author, or put yourself in the reviewer's shoe, the author does this for you. What does that do, right? Think about this for a second. You're basically telling the reviewer, hey, you're smart. You're not even on this paper with me as a co-author, but you see the holes in this study. You're smart. And you know what? I've dealt with them. And here's the alternative test. Here's the alternative measure. Imagine the goodwill and the positive affect that creates across the wire You never met this reviewer, you're not in the same room with them, but you've just generated positive affect with that reviewer and goodwill, right? Because you've told them they're smart, right? And they're looking at you saying, hey, this person asked the hey, but question, right? They were their own biggest critic. Now I trust them, right? Positive affect and trust. The OB scholars on this call, I think they can tell us those things probably have some relation, right? There's a correlation between meeting somebody, generating positive affect, and generating trust. We've just done that remotely across the wire through the anonymous review process, right? Use that confirmation bias to your advantage by addressing problems reviewers are likely to raise as they're reading the paper, right? Show them you've done it, you've been your own biggest critic. It demonstrates and generates this trust across the wire that's just critical to the review process. So what is this body of evidence? Just summarizing, right? Ask the sure but questions, add supplemental analyses, add post hoc analyses, do all of these things, right? And so you might think to yourself, well, gosh, Tim, sure, but then you as the big annoying AE is going to tell me you've got too many pages and it's going to get desk rejected because it's over 40 pages, right? So, well, the nice thing about the world today that our friends in the 1980s didn't have the advantage of is, right? How many folks get paper copies of the journals anymore, right? I do, because I'm right on the cusp of being an old, guard. But most of my reading, honestly, is done on my iPad and whatnot, right? And all the papers are on the web. And the nice thing is now most, if not all, journals have these supplemental documents that can be published online, okay? So it is perfectly fine for you to generate your tight 40-page manuscript and then have another 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 pages of tables, a supplemental text that's going to support what it is you're finding. All those extra analyses you'd like to include in the paper, put them in an appendix, and tell on the submission, if you're fortunate enough that this paper advances, that material you would intend to be some sort of an online appendix or made available upon request or something like that. And let the now don't make it 50 pages in that appendix. Make it 5, maybe 10, because the reviewers still have to go through that material, but that gives you a little bit of cushion to do some of this stuff in a way that you might not have been able to do in the past. I'm a big fan of these sorts of things. Okay. Switch gears a little bit. So Insu talked a little bit about some of the trends in the field, and I think this is important, right? That in science in general, and I think management, we're a little behind, but we're catching up quickly. This idea towards transparency, data sharing, code sharing, right? We all have to embrace this. It's becoming a requirement at some journals, and I think certainly by the end of my career, and for those that are a lot younger than me, by a very short order in your career, this is going to be the norm, and it's a means to generate that trust. And you don't have to wait. So I'm going to talk about SMJ. SMJ is not a requirement yet. It's maybe down the road. I'm not in the room for those discussions, but I suspect those things are being talked about by the co-editors. But you don't have to wait, right? If you write a paper and you put in there that basically it says, hey, if this paper gets accepted, I'm going to share the data. I want SMJ has these things called open data badges, right? And you'll actually get a little icon on your title page of your paper that if this paper is accepted, I'll share the data. I'll share the code. Whatever it is, right? Imagine the trust that generates, right? That you're willing to put your neck out there. That's going to make a huge impact on the trust that you're generating with reviewers throughout that process. So I encourage you people to embrace that. Embrace code sharing. The computer science folks, they've had these collaborative tools. For those who are real nerdy, there's websites out there like GitHub where you can actually publish code. There's all of these things that we do that everybody on this call has had to do at some point in time. Go and merge data from different sources, things like that, especially the macro folks using words data, right? Why don't we share the code on the OB side, the code that's used to maybe generate, summarize scores from the raw data, right? Like, why isn't that just freely available code that you can download and run in SPSS or SAS or whatever it is you're using? And on and on and on. So we should be embracing this. Being a community of scholars, we should be using these websites, publishing our code, inviting people to criticize it and update it, make it better, sharing our data through these tools. And I think we would push our field a lot further forward if we consider doing that. I do want to mention just along this idea of transparency and all that. I'm told as an AE at SMJ, we got an email a few weeks ago that there are methodological reporting standards coming from SMJ soon to kind of go along with what we've seen at some of these other journals. So keep your eye out for that. And when they come, you better follow the rules or you're going to get desk rejected, right? So, don't do that. Get that paper out, do the easy things that you can do. So the review process, it's the worst possible system except for all the others. Miller 2006, obviously quoting Churchill, right? And I think we all have been through the process, would agree. But it's the system we have, and it's, again, it's probably not likely there's a better one. So we have to deal with it. So what do we do, right? So, what have I gotten myself into, right? There's biased judgments, there's author status, still, can affect things sometimes, even though there's a blind review process. There's confirmation bias, there's reviewer disagreement. Miller, quoting Starbucks, said 29 of papers in top journals don't belong there. So what do we do about all this stuff, right? So, well, you can find other work. If you can't deal with this stuff, do that now, because this is the life of an academic. But there are ways to kind of deal with this, right? Well, first thing is, if you're new at this, go learn. Right? Go learn about the review process. Do reviews, read reviews. If you've never seen a review and you're about to submit a paper, stop. Go to your advisor, go to a colleague, go to a friend in the field. If you don't have any of those, email me and I will send you one, right? Ask somebody to share with you the original paper, the reviews, the editorial letter, the response letter they sent back, and that whole dance. Right? And take some time to read through it and understand what that process looks like. If you've never seen that, you should not submit a paper. You should go read that and understand how that dance works so that you can see it. And actually, you should ask your advisor or mentor, send one that was rejected with scorn so you can sort of see what that looks like and see all the dumb mistakes that your esteemed advisor made early on in their career. And so you can understand what this looks like. This isn't some secret society. Take a look at this stuff. Ask anybody in academia. I am sure they're going to be willing to share with you a hard reject and an accept ultimately, and what that process looked like. You can learn from just skimming through those things. Understand the review forms in each journal, right? There are certain questions we ask the reviewers to rate your paper on. Understand what that form looks like. A lot of journals have them published online. If you can't find them, ask one of the AEs to send it to you. Go through this process, build this body of evidence when you're writing your paper. All the things I talked about, the supplementals, the anecdotal data examples, multiple measures, multiple approaches, all this kind of stuff. Understand how that can affect the psychology of a reviewer by generating affect, trust, and demonstrating that you were critical of your own work, right? That's so important. And then the last thing I'll say is this process is noisy. Good papers get rejected, bad papers get accepted. The only way you can solve that problem is to have multiple irons, multiple projects, if you will, in the fire, right? Like, don't rest your life, your career on one paper. If you're at a school where you need a certain number, 5 or 6 or 4, whatever the number is to likely get tenure, if you only have 5 projects going, you're unlikely to get tenure, right? You're probably going to have 8, 10, 12 projects going, through the process to make sure you've got 5 or 4, whatever the number is, by the time you've got tenure. That's the only way. Think about each submission as an additional measure. Multiple measures increase reliability in the field's assessment of you as a scholar, right? And so any one measure, any one paper, our assessment of you might be subject to a lot of noise. And that's just the business we're in, and we have to deal with that. When it's your turn to review, the last thing, just a little tip on this, not necessarily methods related, but I think it's important. Well, volunteer early. Do conferences now if you're a student or early in your career as a professor. But by the time you're ending your career as a student, and certainly right as you're starting your career as an early stage faculty member, reach out to AEs, introduce yourself, get into the systems and update your keywords and make yourself available as an editor. Raise your hand. Find the AEs that are most close to the work that you do. If I'm that person, send me an email. I am always looking for good reviewers. I see Chris nodding her head. I know she's in the same boat, Insu, the same boat. So ask us. We'll be happy to send you a paper to review, because reviewers are hard to find. When you get the privilege of being a reviewer, and it is a privilege, right? Be kind and developmental. Craig Crossland, a great friend of mine, He got the Developmental Reviewer of the Year award at AMR. I put the link to this YouTube video in there. I'll make sure the slides and this get shared so that you guys can click on this. But he goes through this thanks model about what you should include in a review. And I think it's, even though it's about a theory journal, I think he actually talks about empirical stuff in there as well. I think it's a great model to follow if you're starting to write a review and I have no idea, hit new, file new on Word, and you're looking at the blinking cursor to write a review. It's almost as daunting as when you do the same thing to start writing a paper. But always say something nice. As a reviewer, right, or an editor, the first thing I look for in a review is something nice to say for that opening paragraph where, but 2 reviewers have read your paper and both responded positively some aspects. Reviewer 1 said, I want to be able to put that nice thing you said in there. And reviewer 2, I want to be, and then I say something nice myself, and then I get into the nitty gritty of it. Let's start by being nice. There's always something, say something nice. And then Craig has some other things about being brief and being thoughtful and how to think about the review process. So I won't rehash what he said, but have a look at that video. It's well worth it. And Craig's always entertaining. Remember also, you're being scored as a reviewer. So when I'm an AE, every review I get, I click a button that scores you, rates you on a score of 1 to 4 on 2 different measures. Were you on time and how good was the review? And other journals have different measures, but that's what SMJ has. And we use those scores to help us figure out who's going to be on the editorial board. So if you want to be on the editorial board, we'll be on time. That gets you a 4 right off the bat. And then, the second thing is do a good review and you get good scores, you'll be asked to be on the editorial board. And if you're on the editorial board, maybe you'll have a shot at being an AE down the road. But also remember, the AEs and the editors that you're doing this stuff for probably are going to be the folks that also get asked to write your tenure letters from the road, right? So you're not anonymous to them, right? So do good work. If you're going to do reviews, do good work. And also remember, these are the folks that are making decisions on your papers as well, not just writing your letters. So, generate goodwill there. It can't hurt. And that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. That's very helpful. And especially the interaction with the simulation, that definitely demonstrates the core idea. So let's give the 3 panelists another round of applause before we dive into the questions. Okay. So I have, Tim, can you please stop sharing your screen? I will sharing my list of the questions from the audience. So I have tried to put the questions in themes and organize them together. So when you take a look here, they may not be the same order as it shows up on the chat box, but I would like to start with the tougher questions first for the 3 panelists altogether. Then we'll talk about the more specific ones. So first of all, there was one question about qualitative methods. I'm wondering if, or the audience are wondering if any of you have comments in terms of building confidence when researchers are working on qualitative data, interviews, observations, so on and so forth. Any observation? I know most of you are working on based on experimental survey or archival data research. So this might not be a very a great question to address. Even from my perspective, I don't even know.
I've published qualitative work before, so I'm hardly an expert, but I don't see it as different from quantitative research. I mean, to me, it's, so I think the standards for, publishing in AMJ or Org Science, in terms of publishing qualitative work is similar in that it's about, again, following norms, using an established method. There are not a ton of different qualitative methods that we use in the field. So pick one, follow it, and then and how do you find out which methods people are using? Well, look at the journal that you're targeting. and find out, what method are people using to analyze their data, and then follow that, learn that method, and then follow that method, and then being very clear about your data and about how you analyzed it and how you derived your results. I think in my mind, it's a very similar process. Who were your participants? How did you get them? Were you snowballing? What was your sampling criteria? How did you go about making sure that you got the right participants? Those are really crucial questions. And so, yeah, so again, look at the journals that you're aiming for. What did those authors do? And then follow their methods and follow the way in which they've reported those results. You can find reporting guidelines as well. I mean, APA, I should say. APA has guidelines for reporting qualitative results and mixed methods results. And I believe other journals do as well. So making sure that you follow those standards is really important too. Oh, and then sorry, I should say also using all of your data. I mean, I actually do review a decent amount of qualitative work. And one of the things that I see really frequently is that authors don't always use all of their data. So they might say things like, oh, well, we have all this interview data, and then we also have all this archival data, but then they don't tell us anything archival data. Let's say that there's so in my, we did one study where we had interview data, but we also took photographs. And so we talk about how we use those photographs and how we also use the interview data. And that's really important too. If you say, oh, we have all this interview data and we have these photographs, but then you tell us nothing about the photographs, then you're kind of missing out there. Or let's say you have video data and you tell us how did you code that video data and how did you use it? How do you integrate those things together? That's really important. If you can get multiple sources of data, so not just interviews, but also other things, and how you weave them together into a beautiful story is really important. So I just don't see it as very different.
Thank you, Chris.
If I could just
go ahead.
On that really quick and make two comments. First is, one of the best bits of advice I got as a doc student was, go find a paper in the literature that's as closest to yours structurally, that you think you want yours to be, and then follow that as a roadmap of how to build your paper. Follow the way they build their arguments, almost paragraph by paragraph. Not to copy, not to plagiarize what they're saying, but to copy the roadmap of how they built their arguments and structured their paper. So don't be afraid to do that. And then of course you're going to deviate in some ways, but if you start with that as a roadmap, I think that's going to go a long way. The second thing is, assume that the person that's reading your paper, the reviewers, having a clue about the method you're using. And by the way, this applies to empirical stuff as well. I mean, I get papers to review where I've never run that type of empirical model. And so as an author, you want to some degree, write it like you're getting somebody who hasn't a clue. And you got to hold their hand through the process a little bit. And so that applies to qualitative, quantitative, doesn't matter. So I think not assuming your paper is going to be reviewed by somebody who's as expert at that method as you are. Don't assume that, because that's not always the case.
Thank you, Chris and Tim. Also, following up on this question, the friendly reviewer step could also be helpful if you are getting into that field of qualitative research, attending workshops, getting to know the more experienced experts in the topic area, and then maybe you can ask for that researcher to give you some comments, and that will be very helpful in terms of getting to know what are the best way to establish that confidence from the reader's perspective. So let's move on to the next question, which is about the the misconception that every hypothesis has to be supported in order to get accepted. So any comments from the panelists on this question?
So
What if you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have some comment about this question. So my understanding about whether A's or like a journals accept some papers or not depends upon so many things actually, not just whether some of your hypotheses are not supported or not. So I think you need to actually take a broad perspective about journal journal acceptance processes. If other parts of your papers are great, then I think having one or two hypotheses not supported, empirically supported, is not a problem. So my answer to this question is that it depends. It doesn't depend upon journal. It depends upon other parts of your paper. If your other parts of your papers are great and impressive, then I think it's not going to be a problem. So it's not journal specific. It's not A specific. It's not reviewer specific. That's my answer or comment to this question.
I think the only thing I would add is that if you, for example, have, let's say some interaction terms that you've added in, and those are what's not supported, but you don't have the power, the statistical power to actually find support for them, so you find, for example, all of your direct effects are supported, but none of your interaction terms are, but it's probably because of lack of statistical power, then I think that would raise red flags because it means you just haven't done your homework. You haven't provided us your test of those hypotheses is insufficient. And so you were going to make conclusions about, oh, we didn't find support for these hypotheses, but you didn't find support because of a lack of statistical power. That would be suspect and probably would not be looked upon very well.
To build upon Chris's example, let's say if you have competing expectations, then one moderator doesn't work out, but the other was producing great results. That could be something that you can use to test the different theoretical predictions. If that particular research question has two directions in terms of theoretical arguments. So I totally agree with Ying-Su and Chris. This is more of a whole package quality and confidence issue, rather than counting the percentage of hypotheses that were not supported. And one thing I want to add is for the non-supported hypotheses, it will be more informative to discuss and even speculate why it was the case in the discussion section. And also maybe giving future researchers some hints in terms of where they can improve if they want to pursue, replicate, or extend your study on those unsupported directions.
And to build on what Zen just said, is it's also a place where you might run a post hoc analysis to sort of say, hey, my conjecture is the reason why this didn't work is give you a reason. And then maybe you can run a test. Now, you didn't hypothesize it. You don't want to make too big a deal out of it, but then you can say, hey, with our data, we could run a limited test to test that idea. And it looks like that's true. Fantastic. You've now turned your non-finding into something cool, and other people can run with that for a future study, or you can run with it with a future study.
And that's a great way to engage the audience, the readers, and the review team to show that you are candid and frank about what's going on with your research steps. Great. That addressed his question, I hope. And the next few questions I actually combine them together here in terms of the, I'll give you a minute to read it because it's a long question. The essence is about the implicit or explicit expectations or trends in different journals and how do we deal with it. Like the more specific question is about the Bayesian approach. For example, if one journal is more in favor of it, and do we have to worry about, like, if we do that approach in analysis, and we have no luck in the particular journal, our chance of moving on to other journals may be reduced if we stay with the Bayesian method as an example, if the second journal is not so open to the Bayesian approach. And of course, there are other implicit and tacit knowledge or norms that if you want to share with the audience, that'd be great.
So I think I'm going to take that question. I'm sure like other like A's can answer this question as well. My experience at JP Stat, I think JP doesn't like PLS. So if you want to test your research questions using latent modeling, then it's better to use SEM, not PLS. So I think that's one implicit norm that I learned from JP, because we have a specific kind of boilerplate comment for the authors who use the PLS testing their latent models. So I think that's something you may want to avoid. But there are other explicit norms, I think, which is in the case of JAP, I think we have explicit methodological checklists. So please take a careful look at that and try to address, I think, many important issues before submitting your paper to a journal. So I think one piece of advice I have for all of you guys is actually, if you are targeting JAP or SNJ or JWM, then or NPSAC, Jen is here. So then you got to learn about each of these journals, like Tim and Chris already mentioned that you got to do your homework. I think then you will learn about their implicit and explicit norms and expectations for the methodological rigor.
Thank you, Chris. In terms of Bayesian approach, I remember JAP has multiple papers using the Bayesian methods. And I think that the trend is getting up in other journals too. So at this year's Academy and also in previous years, the Research Methods Division have PDWs on Bayesian methods. So that's something is on the agenda. Personally, I am, I'm a believer that Bayesian has great potential to address some of the frequencist, limitations, and we at least have to be open to that approach and be able to read and appreciate that particular perspective. So in terms of other pre-registration, data transparency, those type of requirements, as Ying-Hsu mentioned, it is sometimes journal specific. Like at PSAC, we do have a data availability statement that you can have just a checkbox that you saying that you are willing to provide your data, but it's not required at this stage. However, I believe it's the same at the JOM. At the conditional acceptance stage, you are supposed to provide your outputs with syntax so that the associate editor can double check and see if your approach and analytical methods are appropriate. And that is a great step where the authors can correct some typos in their tables. Like I as an author, I always find numbers wrong or which is not serious, but it'll be awkward later on when you find out one value is off. Although the conclusions are the same, but it will save you a lot of grace in terms of disgrace, or in terms of you don't have to publish a correction to your table or to your methods. So any other thoughts on this this group of questions here in terms of trends and practices?
The only thing I'd add is probably more so than any time in the last 30 years, this stuff is moving. And so it's incumbent on you as an author to, before you submit, go to the website of the journal, see if there's an updated, even from, you might have looked 6 months ago, right before you submit, go and see if there's been any updates to the editorial statement of, call for papers, whatever, the guidelines for what's supposed to be there. And I always encourage folks to go and look at the recently in press papers and skim through the most recently accepted papers, the ones that haven't even gone through formatting yet, because you can actually see what did the author submit and it got accepted. And if you can find one that's relevant to the topic you're writing about, you might be able to glean some insights about trends in, methodological reporting or new tests they might want, things like that, right? So go right to the bleeding edge there, right to the, the non-edited, recently accepted papers, early view, whatever you want to call it, and you can probably learn some things there. But other than that, keep asking questions to your colleagues and come into things like this. And this is something where you're going to just accumulate knowledge on this topic over time.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, that's a great idea. So looking at the just accepted papers, and that give you a much closer look and closer to your own manuscripts in terms of what you can adjust it.
I'll also say one other thing is when you're submitting papers, most journals are open, and certainly SMJ is, to you requesting who might be the AE. You might put 2 names down of who folks you might want to be your AE, and also even potential reviewers. Makes my life easier. People think, oh, it's inappropriate to do that, but no, it makes my life easier as an AE to know, hey, these are some folks. No, don't make it your best friend. Don't make it your office mate from grad school or your dissertation advisor, because if we figure that out, you're doomed, right? Be realistic about it. And I'll probably, as an AE, give you one of the, of the 2 reviewers I'm going to assign. There's a real good chance I'm going to pick one of the names you gave me, or directionally understand based on that name, similar people to pick. And if you do that, and you're going through the early view papers, if you can find a paper where it says, let's say you request me and you find an early view paper of a paper that I just accepted. Well, there's some insight for you, right? Now you can go look at a paper, that just got through the gauntlet that is Tim Quigley, and see if there's any idiosyncrasies there that I'm not even aware of, right? So anyhow, anything you can do like that to tilt the scale in your favor, it's going to be super helpful.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to follow up on that. I know some journals, they probably they will not have explicit instruction for authors to specify the proposed AEs, but I assume that if you respectfully suggest a few AE names or reviewer names, that will not hurt you as long as they're not your friends, right? So as long as you follow the professional codes, because that will save some trouble from the action editor and the editor-in-chief in terms of assigning AEs and reviewers. But on the second point, though, some journals may not show the editor's names. So I guess SMJ may have the additional information there, but the PSEC is not showing the associate editor who accepts a particular paper. So that's a particular difference across.
It's only if they put it in the acknowledgement. So randomly, some people will say, thanks to so-and-so for giving me friendly reviews, and thanks to the AE for shepherding the paper through the process. That's the only time it's revealed in SMJ. Yeah. It's in the acknowledgements.
Yeah. Great. So let's move on to the next set of questions. I want to make sure that we cover all the questions from the audience. So this one is also a general question for the 3 panelists. So sometimes there's no right way or no single right way to analyze the data. What would you recommend in terms of methodological approaches?
I think I can take that. I think my answer is very simple. So if I were you, I would actually do all the analysis, even though they are different, requested by reviewers. Why not just do all of them, right? But then I think, in some sense, I think the AE should be clear about what he or she wants, right? So because, reviewers are just making recommendation and AEs are making decisions. So I think, part of the problem is AE, but, Yeah, I will try to actually do, all the analysis required by the even different reviewers and different analysis. Then I'm going to show that the results are pretty much similar, or like it's a concept of triangulation, right? So I would do that actually. There's no reason to choose one of them, right? Because you want to please both reviewers or 3 reviewers, depending upon which journal you are talking about. So I would do everything.
Thank you, Yinsu. I assume Chris and Tim will agree here for the triangulation effort. And also, I agree that the action editor needs to be clear in terms of his or her preference, rather than being ambivalent about what to do. For example, if the action editor thinks that a new data set needs to be collected in order to boost the contribution, that has to be clearly stated there, rather than letting the authors try to guess what the guidance is. And like one reviewer may say there's no need for additional data, the other reviewer may recommend going out and collecting data to triangulate. So in that big effort direction, the AE does have to be very specific in order to do a better job giving the author guidance. But in terms of analytical skills, that could be could be a good way to triangulate your results and have robust checks. That is a perfect example where you can show your efforts as authors to just do them all, and even include them in the supplementary online file. Nowadays, all journals have those places where you can, as Tim mentioned, you can add 10 pages of tables for additional analysis there. That actually boosts up the confidence from the reader's perspective. Okay. So next one is about hurdles of data, like student sample, MTurk, in terms of your thoughts based upon your experience. MTurk prolific, does data from those sources be helpful in terms of generalization issues? And even in strategy articles, I would imagine that if you have to validate a measure or pre-test, some of the online panels are becoming more and more popular in SMJ. Any comments?
Yeah, I can take that comment as well. So I think this is partly based upon what I presented, I guess. So I think if your sample is less generalizable, then I think your theorization and your like a discussion about the sample should be very, very detailed and enriching and in-depth, I guess. So for example, like I already mentioned that if your sample is only nurses or doctors, then I think you got to provide in-depth understandings of the context and the sample, so that you can compensate for the issue of less generalizability. And also, I think when you are using MTurk samples or prolific samples, there's a way you can make them generalizable across different organizations and different jobs. So try to do that. And also, when you are using student sample, I think if your research question is about like a basic and fundamental human phenomena, then I think you can actually justify the use of student sample. But still, like if you are targeting applied journals like a JAP or JOM or SMJ, then I would say you got to collect another data based upon employees or like entrepreneurs and things like that. That way, I think you can actually you can enhance your studies generalizability as well as like a internal validity as well, like not necessarily internal validity, but I think generalizability as well as kind of in-depth knowledge about the phenomenon, I guess. So I think because my experience about MTurk or prolific samples, as an AE, as an editorial board member, as an author, is that some people view that as actually a kind of easy way to work on a research project. No, the negative responses to this kind of samples that, yeah, it's very easy to collect those kind of samples as long as you have money, right? So I think to overcome that, I think you got to provide something else, like a in-depth knowledge and I think a very careful theorization, but don't try to over-justify the use of this kind of samples by saying that other studies use that, they publish those samples in other top-tier journals. I found that if you over-justify that, then actually it's kind of you are revealing that you know your own limitations. So I think pretty much like that's what I want to say, and I'm sure like others can chime in on that.
Thank you, Yinsu. I often use prolific for validation purposes. If I have adapted a scale by changing some of the key terms, not only the referent, but maybe some context of certain behaviors are changed, then I have to validate it. That is, I think that's a very good way of using those online panel for skill validation. But for testing the substantive model, if you only have online panel, then that definitely will raise an impression of lower confidence, coming back to Chris' term, because some of the psychology of the reviewers, you have to think about from their perspective. When they read that your article is well written on the theory, hypotheses are great, but the data is only coming from online samples, except for the COVID year. If it's a normal year and you may have some chances to collect real employees' data to test your question, and that will be great. But the author team did not do that. That may send a subtle signal in terms of reviewers and readers and IE will wonder what's going on there. Was there some special reason? And once the suspicion is generated, then it's very hard to get rid of. So that's something you want to consider to proactively show that you care about your research, you care about the rigor and the general reliability of your findings, so that you should try your best to triangulate with a field data set, and supplement that with online panel analysis should be fine. But if you solely have prolific or MTurk or other panels data, that could be at least implicitly viewed as not adhering or respecting the rigor of that particular journal. Again, you can read the most recent publications to see if there are any examples where a study used 3 MTurk samples but no field data, whether they have a very important research question. It's possible to have those publications, but they may have a reason, a legitimate reason of doing that. And if that reason does not apply to you, then you have to really think twice on your decision. Tim.
Yeah, if I could just from the macro perspective, I see a lot of papers where there's all these awesome tools out there now where people are using text to try and glean some psychological trait of an executive or video or, all kinds of things. And I think the biggest question I get from reviewers, and it's a question I ask myself as I read these papers, is, are we really getting at whatever it is the person's saying? Is there construct validity to this measure? And so in those cases, it's often possible to, rather than MTurk or a student sample being the primary sample, it's often possible to maybe go find some sample where you can run just a test to validate that, yes, when I watch a video and I assess a CEO's introversion and extroversion based on that video, well, I found some sample of videos, we did this, we got some scores, but we were able to also have those people fill out the paper and pencil survey or, an online survey to tell us what their introversion, extroversion was. And we can validate that, right, through some measure, some way. And it just goes so far to develop that trust, because without that, reviewers are just real skeptical. So using those tools to bolster your believability, I think is critical.
Thanks. So the next question, I believe the panelists have already answered in terms of, if you upload your R codes and supplementary materials in the initial submission, I think that is helpful. That will not hurt you in any way. It can only help you in terms of building up the confidence. So let's just skip that one. It's always good to be transparent in the beginning stage. Then the next two are actually linked together in terms of being exhaustive in your writing, in your description, versus being parsimonious. So what if you have 10 hypotheses you want to present? And if you have to be parsimonious, you can condense them. What is the magic number? And in terms of describing the methods and the results sections, how do we strike that balance between establishing confidence and being exhaustive versus being parsimonious in the writing and keep the reader engaged?
I can take that comment. I guess it's also partly based upon some of the materials I presented. So I think answer to this question is actually there's no single best answer to this question. It depends upon the research context or what theories, what theory you are using for your theorization. But I think most theories actually the core of most theories is actually making parsimonious explanations about the phenomena of interest, right? So I think most theoretical models do not have to be very complex. I think, so I don't know whether, 10 variables should be included or 5 variables should be included. Like I said, it depends upon your theorization as well as theory and also what phenomena you are focusing on. But I think it's more like art, not necessarily, the science part of the research process. But I think, you got to understand the theory and then also you got to think carefully about your major research questions, because we need actually a lot of studies even for this same phenomena, same simple phenomena. So don't try to address all the issues in the literature. Try to focus on some important issues based upon existing literatures, because oftentimes when I see very complex models, I see also a lack of careful literature review. So when you do careful literature review, you're gonna see some research gaps, but not a whole lot of gaps, right? So you don't have to really come up with very complex model, because I think that's more like a novice mentality to try to address all the question in one research project. I think research actually and science progresses gradually by little by little. So I guess I think you got to actually start with careful literature review and then you're gonna identify some important research gaps and try to address those gaps carefully using rigorous methodology. That's kind of my general. Maybe it's not satisfying to the person who asked this question, but I think this is kind of my honest advice, I think, to this question.
Thank you, Insoo. To add to your suggestions, I often find using a copy editor to condense my writing was helpful. Sometimes I may have 10 pages, for writing up 2 hypotheses, but once I use the service of a copy editor, she can reduce, by deducting 3 pages out of the 10-page writing. So that's a much concise way to convey the same ideas without losing much information. As a non-native speaker of English, I find sometimes I just writing more indirectly than I should be. So using a friendly reviewer or a copy editor helping you to streamline the writing could be a way to be more parsimonious, but not losing the critical information you want to convey to the reader. Other thoughts? Okay. Given the time, let's move on to a few specific questions here. And I'm sure that the audience may have additional questions. And then after the session, I encourage the audience to email and contact our panelists if you have questions remaining for them. The first one is about a particular question to Yingsu, where p less than 0.10 is appropriate. So without putting Yingsu in the spot, I think the most common case where a one-tailed significance test is appropriate is for the variance. If you are testing a variance estimate, say in longitudinal data where you have latent growth model, and you want to test whether the variance of the slope factor is positive. And because a variance estimate cannot be negative, then that's a perfect example where one-tailed test of significance is appropriate. And that translates to p less than 0.10 if you use a two-tailed test. So that's one case that always comes to my mind in terms of what the situation where it is totally appropriate. Yingsu, if you have other examples in terms of this question.
Yeah, I think I already mentioned that I think you can justify the use of one-tailed test because p is smaller than 0.10 two-tailed test is actually p smaller than 0.05 one-tailed test, right? So when you have directional hypothesis, so if your hypothesis has a clear direction, like positive relationship, right? And we can also apply this to even mediational hypothesis when you have clear a direction for that, because usually most hypotheses have clear direction. So I think we can justify the use of one-tailed test as long as you provided rationale. But if you just use one-tailed test without any rationale or without any clarification, then reviewers may think that you are not your research is not rigorous. You just try to play with the result, kind of marginally significant results. So I think clarify that. And also when you are testing interactions and moderations, there are multiple papers, especially about the moderating effect. Hermann Agnes and his colleagues have done several, published several papers about the lack of statistical power sufficient for detecting interaction effect. And he said, since type 2 error, minimizing type 2 error is as important as minimizing type 1 error. They said that I think one way we can address this issue is actually we can use one-tailed test for testing moderating effect or a 90% confidence intervals, right? And then also mediation is the same thing. When you are multiplying two test coefficient, obviously I think we know that number is very small, right? And also it requires a large statistical power to detect that. So I think you can justify that, but I think my advice is that you need to provide those rationales rather than just assume that the reviewers and action editors are aware of that. Most of us actually have learned about those things, but sometimes we can forget about things, right? So I think you need to provide those reasons explicitly. That's my recommendation and advice.
Thank you, Yingsu. Considering the time, I think we need to move on to other questions, making sure that they all get covered. So the next one is about examples, templates that we can read. So on this one, I can give a brief answer here. Some journals like PSYC, Personnel Psychology, has the best paper awards for a particular year. Every year we give out awards. for a paper published 3 years ago. So though, if you are targeting at a particular journal, just look at the most cited paper of that journal and see how the authors in that award-winning article or or most cited article from that journal report their results. That will be a great template. AMJ also has the best paper. Does it have best paper? AMR has it. Maybe the past decades. I remember that past decades or 2 decades ago, decade award for those best papers. So those are great examples for you to use to strengthen your own writing. So the next question, again, is more general. In terms of JAP, JOM, and SMJ's potentially attitude toward pre-registered studies and replication studies. So I know this is more of a question for the editor-in-chiefs, but I would appreciate any thoughts you have on those trends moving on in the general psychology, management, and science fields.
I mean, at Journal of Management, we've not had these discussions yet. So I don't think there's any move toward pre-registration studies or toward replication research. I mean, I know some journals, I think, oh goodness.
JBP is a great example there.
Thank you, yeah. Some journals have really embraced this, but I don't think yet that it's something that every journal has embraced.
It takes time for the whole field to accept this as a norm. It's emerging on the horizon, but we probably have to wait and see. For example, PSych, we have not formally discussed pre-registration studies yet.
Well, and it's also journals serve different purposes. I mean, you think about, let's say, AMJ, which probably or org science, probably of I would say, in terms of journals that publish micro research, kind of have the highest bar for, theoretical, kind of providing new theoretical insights. And so, there's this, but still, I think that kind of push to provide new theoretical insights is something that JAP certainly demands. It's something that Journal of Management certainly demands. It's something that personnel psychology certainly demands. And so there's just sometimes different journals are serving different needs in the marketplace of knowledge. So I think to some extent, it may not be something that every journal does decide to embrace, but I mean, I'm hardly a prognosticator, so.
Yeah. If I can just touch on the replication side from SMJ's perspective. So this is something SMJ has explicitly said they'll do. But it remains a challenge. They've actually said they'll do all kinds of stuff. Theoretical work, replications. They have this thing called a data paper now. If you've got a cool data set, I've published one of these now. If you're willing to publish the data and tell us about it and do some things with it. But the journal, I think, is still trying to figure out what it means. What's an A publication for these things? And so replication is actually there's a from the editor opinion piece or something at SMJ where they talk about, well, what are the types of replications? And this all came out of a special issue of replications. They talk about narrow replications and more broad replications, and there's definitions about what this means and how you would go about doing the different kinds. And so if you're going to do this kind of stuff, really understanding what they're calling for, but also signaling to your reviewers that this is what you're doing and you're doing it in response to a call from the journal, right? So you can't assume that they're, like at SMJ, it's okay at SMJ to be light theoretically. And not all reviewers may be fully on board with or just conscious of that as they're reading your paper. And so being very explicit in your introduction that pursuant to the call of papers for replications, we're doing what Bettis called a narrow replication for this purpose, right? And being very explicit about it so that you might, the reviewer might be like, oh, wow, I didn't even know that was a thing. And now you've at least triggered them to at least consider that. But also, the paper still has to make a contribution, right? There has to be something in there where I often have, I've written this in decision letters or as a reviewer, where I've said, what is the contribution of this paper? Like somebody down the road 2 years, 3 years from now, that's going to cite your paper. What are the 3 or 4 sentences they would put before they cite your name? And if you can't think of what that answer is, doing the replication or doing a study that doesn't have, only has null findings or, whatever, what's the point, right? There still has to be a so what to it. And if you can't answer that question, stop until you can.
Thanks, Tim. Insoo, please.
Yeah. Basically, I think my answer is pretty much the same as others. I think if other things are good, yeah, that's it's possible to publish these kind of studies. So I think you got to have other good things because it's an entire package thing, not just whether this is pre-registration study or replication study, right? And then regarding the last question, I think I'm thinking about many meta-analysis, and I'm hesitant to single out one meta-analysis as an example for testing a moderator that has never been tested in any of the input studies. But I can think of one of the panelists in a meta-analysis. One by Chris Byron, like a post and Byron AMJ meta on the relationship between female representation on the board and firm performance. They had multiple moderators, I think 2-3 moderators, and they tested using sort of meta regression. So I think as I said, I think it depends upon which theorization or which theory you're going to use. But the most important thing you should remember when you are working on a meta-analysis and when you are targeting a top-tier journal, you got to have something you got to have some original insights that are not readily available from any of the meta-analysis. Think about it. If you're a meta-analysis summary, then I think you can publish that in some journals, but not it's going to be difficult to publish that in top-tier journals because top-tier journals are looking for some unique and original insights. So I think I already gave you one example, and then also SIAP has an award for meta-analysis, and this award has been around, I think, about 10 years, something like that. So if you check out those, award-winning meta-analysis papers, then you're gonna see how they theorize their modeling effect and how they test their theory-driven models. So that way, I think you can get better insights about how you're gonna go about this. Yeah.
Thank you, Insoo.
Yeah.
That's a great paper on the AMJ meta you mentioned.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have anything to add or?
No, I don't think I have anything.
Okay. Yeah, considering the time and since we have covered all the questions, I know we have some new questions coming up in the chat box, but given the time, I would encourage you to, if you have follow-up questions from the audience, you feel free to email me or the panelists, and especially regarding examples that they can recommend for you to improve your writing and analysis, feel free to do that. And can I assume that the Insoo, Chris, and Tim, you are willing to share your slides afterwards with Karma so that coming up with the video itself, that will be very helpful for researchers to learn and get more insights from your thoughts.
Yeah, who should we send them to, Zen?
You can send the slides to me, then I will forward to
Okay.
the organizer. Yep.
Great.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Insoo, Chris, and Tim, and all the audience members, and also Larry and Kama for this section of the consortium. And this concludes the 4-session consortium for the summer. I hope everyone will have a productive summer and relaxing for the for the next few weeks before the teaching and classes starts again. And I wish you everyone the best, and thank you for those questions and for sharing the thoughts. Let's give us everyone another round of applause.